Okay, so welcome to Research Hers. My first guest is Dr. Charlotte Grosse Wiesmann. Charlotte is a developmental neuroscientist. This means she researches the neuroscience of infants and how they see the world. A lot of her research focuses on the theory of mind. So this is the idea or the ability to have an understanding that other people can have desires and beliefs and perspectives which are different from your own. So yeah, being able to put yourself into someone else's shoes, I guess. Her other research also focuses on things like self-awareness, language, and social cognition. Welcome to Charlotte. How was that introduction? Did I miss anything out?
Yeah, that was great. Hi,
Um,
Bonnie. Thanks a lot for inviting me to the interview. I'm looking forward to chatting a bit about my research.
So tell me more about what you're researching at the moment, or more about the theory of mind research.
Yeah, so my research actually also at the moment focuses very much on how children understand others, what they understand about others, and how they learn from others, and how their own perception of the world is influenced by others. So what we're particularly interested in is this early social cognitive development that leads to a full understanding of other people's mental states. You already introduced the term of theory of mind. So that's the ability to understand what other people have in their mind, what they think and believe. And that's really at the core of my research, to understand how this comes about. And there are actually some findings that so the traditional view is actually that theory of mind develops around late preschool age, around 4 or even 5 years of age. But there is some evidence that very young infants, already in their first or second year of life, are able to predict how other people are going to act based on what they think about the world or what they believe about the world. And that's why some researchers suggest that theory of mind already develops very early. And that's what I'm mostly interested in at the moment, is understanding, what do these little infants do? Do they really understand what's going on in other people's mind, or do they have other ways of understanding how other people are going to act, and other ways of understanding um, like other people, but not inferring really like having a theory of what is in their mind.
So it's part of this because I guess a lot of the studies when they're 3 or 4 is focusing on, like, being able to say whether they understand what is going on with someone else, whereas earlier research is able to show that without using language. Is that right?
Yeah, so that's exactly one of the differences in the tasks that are being done with preschoolers on the one hand and with infants on the other. So the preschoolers can talk, right? They you can ask them questions and they can answer. So you can just basically ask them, where is someone going to search for his keys, for example, if they don't know that their keys have been removed from the place where they put them. That would be a classical task that you could ask a 4-year-old. And obviously a 2-year-old or a 1.5-year-old cannot answer a question like that, because they don't have the language abilities. And that's why there have been nonverbal tests that have been developed, where, for example, researchers have looked at the infant's gaze, and have looked at whether the infants in their gaze can predict where someone is going to look, whether they gaze to the correct location where someone is going to look for an object. So these are tasks that we've also used, and found that to some extent, at least, infants have correct expectations of where other people are going to search. But what we also found is that the brain processes that underlie these expectations are different from the brain processes that support their verbal reasoning about where someone is going to search. And based on that, we're following up on what these infants are doing exactly. What process are they recruiting in order to be able to predict others' actions? And because we don't have language to access exactly what they're doing in their mind, what they're thinking, we have to develop some creative methods and combine different nonverbal methods and also brain research methods to figure out what is actually going on in the infant's head and whether they really infer what is in someone else's mind or whether they might, for example, so one theory we have is that they might be influenced by the other in their own perception of the world.
So did you say that the brain structures before they're 4 for theory of mind seem to be different to when they are 4, or they develop differently? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, yeah. So, what we found is that the brain structures that so the maturation of brain structures that is related to starting to pass verbal theory of mind tasks around 4 years of age, that those are different from the brain structures that are related to success in the infant theory of mind tasks. So basically, even in
Okay.
3-year-olds, for example, 3 and 4-year-olds that pass the nonverbal tasks but don't pass the verbal tasks yet, and then at some point start passing the verbal tasks, we find different brain structures that predict whether children can pass the verbal tasks from those that predict whether they have correct expectations in their gaze of where someone is going to search. And what we also find is that their predictions are not related behaviorally. And so, what we conclude from that is that most probably it's different processes underlying nonverbal expectations of how other people are going to act and really verbally reasoning about what is going on in someone else's mind.
So does that suggest that because when you have younger children which are looking with their gaze, but they also have a different neural structure than the older children with the verbal tasks, does that suggest that maybe the gaze task isn't always an accurate method of theory of mind, or
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. That's going at the core, basically, of of the questions that are raised by those findings. I'm not sure I would say it's not an accurate measure of something. The question is
Mm,
of what it is a measure, and I would say that these findings actually support that it's not a measure of this mature verbal theory of mind. So it's not the same kind of cognitive
okay.
process that is underlying it, but that it's a measure for something different. And this something different is basically what we're researching at the moment, what that is.
Thank you. I'm gonna move on to some of the questions that people have sent in now that we've got an understanding of your research. So the first one is, when do children begin to understand that they exist in the world? Do they have existential thoughts? Are they just constantly terrified? How do they perceive their emotions?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and is also kind of at the core of what we're trying to find out in infants, right? We're trying to find out what is actually going on in their mind, and the simple answer is we don't know. So basically, we really don't know how infants perceive the world and how they perceive their own emotions, and yeah, and we also don't really. So as long as we can talk to the children and can ask them what they're thinking about something, and as long as they can express themselves in a really elaborate way and explain all the thoughts they have in their mind, we have no way of finding out what is really going on in their head. And we can only do that indirectly by testing, for example, whether they can differentiate certain situations and whether they gaze specifically to certain events or not, how they react to different stimuli, so we can assess whether they have emotions by looking at how they react to certain events. But we, of course, don't know how they actually experience these emotions from the inside and whether this is similar to how we do as adults. The only thing we can see is that they show similar bodily signs of these emotions,
Mm,
and I think that that's also something that makes brain science actually quite interesting in infants. Is that this is a way of having another biological measure of
yeah.
what is going on in the infant's mind. Of course, we still don't know whether um, certain brain processes do different things in infants than they do in adults, but we're getting a little bit closer to whether the processes that are going on in the infant's mind are similar to the ones that are going on in the
And
adult.
so In infants, does the brain develop super fast, or is it a more gradual process? Or yeah, how is it developing the
Yeah.
first years?
So actually in the first year of life or the first 2 years of life, it develops very quickly.
Mhm,
So especially in the first, couple of months, after babies are born, the head, grows a lot, really does this kind of exponential growth that then flattens, um,
mhm.
and there's a lot going on. There's, like, a lot of myelination. So in the beginning, when the baby is born, the connections in the brain are basically not myelinated, so they don't have this fat layer around around the fiber connections in the brain, and that only develops then. And there, yeah, there are a lot of different microstructural processes going on in the brain that actually make that, for example, an MRI scan of of an infant in the first half a year of life looks completely different from an MRI scan of a 2-year-old. So,
Okay.
for example, the regions that are originally look white in the infant scan and dark, like there's this white, that there are regions that are lighter and some that are darker, and the regions that look white in the infant brain later look dark in the kid's brain because the microstructure has changed so much.
And that's the myelination, right?
Yeah,
From turning
exactly,
white to dark. Cool.
exactly.
And yeah, I guess, yeah, related to emotion again, someone has asked, can we detect psychopathic traits in children, so not having any empathy, or is it impossible as all children are very egocentric?
Yeah, so, I mean, there are no, like, as far as I know, there is no diagnostic of psychopathic traits in young, children. There are, individual differences, of course, as there are yeah, uh, on all kind of cognitive domains. So, for example, yeah, you see individual differences in empathy or also in theory of mind of children at the same age. But in very young infants, anyway, so anyway, you don't really have something like empathy yet. So that's something that develops first. So in
Mm.
very young infants, you have something that people refer to as emotional contagion. So that's, for example, the effect that when there are several babies in a room and one baby starts crying, the other babies also often start crying, and then they all calm down again in waves. So their emotion actually, yeah, is contagious in a sense, so affects the others. But what they don't seem to have yet, or at least we don't know, or we haven't detected that yet, is this ability to basically really differentiate between the own and the other's emotion and be affected by, but
Okay.
still differentiate that this is not the own emotion, but has an outside um, reason basically to it. So in that sense, yeah, empathy is only something that is developing later. And there was also another aspect of the question you said.
About the self, yeah, about it was yeah, when do children develop a sense of self?
Yeah, exactly, about infant, or also about infants being very egocentric. That was, like, something that
Ah, yeah.
was raised in the question. And, basically, so that it's true that children, from a certain age, like 3, 4, 5-year-old children and school-age children are, often quite egocentric. And also what we kind of see in these theory of mind tasks is that 3-year-olds, if they don't know how to predict how someone else is going to act, they usually base it on their own knowledge. So in that sense, they are egocentric. They predict that someone is going to search for the chocolate where they know the chocolate
Mm,
is, and not where the other thinks the chocolate is. But what we suspect is that it's actually different for infants, that infants aren't egocentric, but that they might actually be quite ultracentric. So that they might be influenced very strongly in their own perspective of the world by others. So maybe even to the extent that sometimes they themselves believe the chocolate to be somewhere where someone else has seen the chocolate. Yeah, so that's basically one of our theories, what infants are doing in order to be able to predict how other people are going to act, that they really take over the other's perspective and are ultracentric. And this would
Okay.
also makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, of course, because infants in their very first years of life are very, very dependent on others, right? So for a half a year old baby, it might be more important to actually know what someone else thinks and how someone else is going to act than to know
Mm.
yourself where the food is, because anyway, you can't get the food yourself, right? I mean, this is just exaggerating it a little bit, but so this is just to illustrate why autocentrism might actually be quite important in early
So
infancy.
that would be almost like an innate. Oh, what was the word? Which is opposite to egocentric, ultracentric.
Ultracentric, yeah,
Ultracentric. So they
ultracentrism.
have an innate ability of ultracentrism, and then they learn how to be egocentric. Is that how, or they would both be innate and different ones are expressed at different times in their life?
Yeah. So I mean, this is at this point, I have to say it's a theory, right? So we don't know for sure yet. But so I wouldn't actually call that an ability in that sense,
Mm.
but I would say they are just born ultracentric. So they take over the other person's perspective
Okay, so you're more of this kind of
automatically.
emotional contagion kind of thing again. They see
Yeah, or
other
not
people
even
having
only
emotions, they
emotionally. Yeah,
yeah.
not even only emotionally, but also cognitively. They might
Okay.
actually be influenced. So, for example, we have evidence that children remember things better that they've seen together with others, and they might not
Okay.
update certain events or memories or representations of their environment if no one else is there with them to witness it. So they might end up actually thinking what someone else thinks rather than relying on their own perceptual experience and their own memory, which they don't have to that extent yet. And and then around in the second year of life or towards the end of the second year of life, there are some marked developments in the self concept of the kids. So
Mm.
that's around the age when children start recognizing themselves in the mirror, and they start having ideas, like they start differentiating between the self and the other in different kind of tasks, and really understanding like that they are a person on their own. It's also the age
Mm.
where many parents, for example, experience that kids get more obsessed about what's their own.
Mhm.
They hold things to themselves and say like, "That's mine," and they also learn the words like "I" and "my" and "mine" and so on.
Yeah. So before that, they're kind of merging themselves with other people and they can't it's all kind of one, they're not able to differentiate between the 2.
Yeah, they might
Okay.
be. That's what we think.
And then someone has asked, "Can you tell us more about how children communicate before they speak?" So I guess you've spoken a little bit about this already.
Yeah, that's also a great question. I mean, there are lots of means basically how infants communicate before they actually start to speak. For example, with their gaze, there's a lot of communication. So around 9 months approximately, for example, they start engaging in joint attention with other people. So they basically gaze at someone else and then they gaze at an object together. So they kind of manage to direct other people's attention and also understand if someone else directs attention to an object. Um, and then in the second year of life, they start pointing to things. And already before, of course, with their gesture, they indicate things and can express their needs and so on. So there are a lot of different dimensions of communication that are actually nonverbal
Mm.
um, before the verbal communication develops in towards the second year of life.
Yeah, so if a child is growing up in a multilingual or bilingual environment, does this yeah, I guess, does it affect that communication before they've even learnt a language? Like, are they taking in both languages, and how is this yeah, I guess affecting pre-learning language and also after?
Yeah. Um, That's an interesting question. I have to admit that I don't actually know whether it affects your nonverbal communication. I would suspect that the early nonverbal communication is I mean, it's for sure influenced by a multicultural environment because, for example, also gestures are different in different cultures. But that basic nonverbal communication, like joint attention and pointing and these kind of things that all kids in all different cultures develop, that these are more or less independent of a multicultural environment.
Mm.
But I have to say that I'm not sure.
Yeah, I've just remembered a bit of research I read, which is the infants are able to discriminate between their own and another language by 6 months old, I think it is. Is it 6 months? I'm not sure.
Actually, even earlier.
Yeah,
So there are even studies showing that at birth, infants show certain signs of differentiating between the
okay.
native language and another language. And there's even one study showing that the babies cry at birth. Um, it has some prosodic features of the own. So the melody, basically, whether it's upwards or downwards oriented, and where the stress is on their crying, is influenced by their mother's native language. So that was actually a quite influential study that was also published, co-authored by our institute, by Angela Federici, that that basically French babies put the stress more towards the end of their cry, whereas German babies put it more towards the beginning of the cry.
And so they're getting that information from when they're in the womb still?
Yeah, so that would be exactly. So if those results are really there in the cry of the newborn, then the only explanation for it could be that they get this prosodic
Yeah.
information in the womb.
That's crazy. Yeah, someone else has asked, why do children rely on others so much in the early years of life, especially compared to other animals, and is there an evolutionary reason for this?
Yeah, so I think I would say there is. So it's very true that children rely very much on others, and that for a very long time they can't really be independent, right? They really need someone to take care of them for probably the first yeah, more than 10 years for sure. Life they wouldn't survive on their own, probably. And this is very long compared to other mammals and other animals in general. And one theory about this is that because infants are inherently social beings, because humans are inherently social beings,
Mm,
they need a long time to learn basically from others. So there is this long phase where they can basically learn socially from others to develop all the complex repertoire
okay.
that we have as humans, the complex cognitive repertoire. And also the brain development is very extended. So they also have a long period in which they can acquire um, complex abilities while still being protected and being taken care for in their basic needs. So it might be that basically this long development actually enables us humans to then become those complex cognitive beings that we are.
And so is that why the gestation period is slightly shorter than it would be for it's supposed to be slightly shorter than a usual animal or primate of our size, right?
Yeah, I'm actually not sure about that.
Yeah, I think the gestation period is supposed to be slightly shorter, and they thought it was because it was shorter because babies' heads are so big, and so because of the hips in women and being bipedal, so being able to walk on two legs, that it wouldn't be able to grow any bigger, and so it has to come out early. But then I think yeah, some of this neuro research is suggesting what you've just said, which is that it's because we need to absorb all these social and cultural norms, and so we need the environment to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I know. I understand now what you're
Mm.
referring to. Yeah, so basically, I think there are different aspects to it. So one is basically really the physical or biological thing that the head can't be too big before it comes through the hips, right? And that also fits well together with this extreme growth of the head in the first couple of months of life. And then a lot of processes happening like pruning and myelination and so on in the brain that make the brain develop and grow. And yeah, so I think those are two things that are also going together in a way that there's a big growth and big development of the brain, like important development of the brain in a phase or in a prolonged phase where children can actually learn from their environment and learn from others around them
Cool.
and pick up and develop complex skills.
Yeah. And I guess this question is related as well, which is kind of about attachment. Someone has asked how healthy is sleep training or quiet out, and will this affect attachment? And also, can babies be too attached?
Yeah, so with the sleep training, I have to say that this is quite controversially debated. So there are very different opinions and they are also polarized. And as far as I know, there are no really convincing or uncontradictory studies about
Okay.
it. So I guess at this point, as a non-scientific opinion, I would say everyone has to go by what they what their gut feeling
Mm.
says, and there should probably be more scientific research on how it really affects infants' behavior and bonding and learning and so on. And yeah, concerning attachment, so that depends, I guess, on how you define attachment. So a positive attachment, right, that is not ambivalent in any way. That is not where the kid doesn't get afraid that the parents are not there enough or something like that. I would say that this attachment can't be too much because being a positive attachment, it will always have a positive effect on the kid, and the kid will also not be worried about being separated from the parents for a short while if it's well attached
Mm.
and doesn't have to worry about the attachment. And I think that the question might rather aim at cases are where children have an insecure attachment and where they get very worried and um, yeah um, yeah get afraid and very worried and start crying a lot and can't calm down anymore in case they get separated from their parents. And this is actually a case of uh, not so good attachment, although it might seem like the kid is too
Yeah.
attached to someone from the outside and doesn't want to be separated.
And so why is attachment important? Does it's supposed to or yeah, kind of relate to relationships later on in life, right?
Yeah, right. So basically, there are a lot of theories and also some research that children who have secure attachment in early childhood with their parents then later have better relationships with their environment and better, yeah, better romantic relationships, but also better friendships, and generally are more stable um,
Yeah,
psychologically.
I remember learning about that when I did, like, A-level psychology or something, and I wondered if the but I think a lot of that research is quite old, so I was wondering whether it's kind of changed now or whether there's kind of an updated model. Or I think I was talking to someone the other day about how that there's almost a social function to having different attachments, and that it doesn't need to be secure in order for you to be able to function properly in the world, and
Yeah, no, I mean, basically, it helps you a lot if you have had a secure attachment, I guess, in early childhood. Seems to be quite predictive of many things later, of relationships and of stability and so on. But obviously, of course, you can overcome also certain issues in the attachment.
so
And
it's not the be all and end
yeah,
all. It's okay if you're not
no, of
securely
course
attached.
not.
And then I've just got one last question, which is going to be a recurring question through the series, because it's called Research Hers. I want to ask, how do you think being a woman in science has affected your work, and have you faced any difficulties or challenges? Or yeah, it's kind of like an open question.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and I've been thinking about it a little bit, and I think the honest answer is that I don't think it has
Yeah.
so much in my research, at least. So yeah, I actually started off as a before I went into developmental neuroscience. I started off as a
Mm.
physicist, so it was in a very male-dominated area. Actually, I was actually in the research group I was in. I was the only
Yeah.
female researcher, And now I switched to an area where there are, I mean, in neuroscience, I think it's more or less
Mm.
mixed, but in developmental psychology, there are definitely more female researchers than male researchers. And yeah, I don't know whether implicitly, maybe I was also influenced by, in my interests by some gender expectations or something. But, I was originally very interested in physics and did my physics studies and graduated in theoretical physics. So in that sense, I think I was not that much influenced.
Thank you so much for letting me interview you. It's been, yeah.
Yeah, of course, very welcome. Thanks for thanks for the nice chat.